there, it's Jane. I'm a watercolor artist, and in this video I will show you my watercolor paints. It's gonna be an art supplies haul directed towards watercolor paints more than anything else. In this video I will show you what I have been using for the past couple of years, what I am currently using, and also some new art supplies that I bought that I want to review. Whatever I bought I already heard good things about. So I have a big pile of watercolor paints on my table, and I thought I would use this opportunity to share this with you. This is not gonna be a review of the final products. If I'm gonna do a review, it's gonna be more thorough. It will definitely involve watercolor painting, but the haul might still be interesting for you, and if you have your own experience with some of these paints, feel free to leave a comment down below and share that experience with us. My main watercolor collection consists of tube paints that I store in these wooden drawers, and I pour the wet paint inside empty palettes such as plastic or metallic palettes. I will get into that later. I rarely buy pens. This gives me a lot of freedom over which colors actually go into my palettes, and I make my selections much easier this way. Sets just don't work for me anymore. The first brand that I have been using ever since I started to paint with watercolor is Schmincke Horadam. I think I was on student grade paints for about 2 months only after I started to learn with watercolor, and then I did have the opportunity to purchase Schmincke Horadam paints from a local art store in Prague where I was living at that time. And the quality of the paint was just remarkable. It was insanely easy to lift from the pens. They didn't have tubes back then, they only had pens, so I purchased about 2 or 3 pens and I never stopped using them. It's been 9 years ever since. They are incredibly high quality paints. They're vibrant, light, fast, most of them. Schmincke watercolor paints are well known for their smoothness, and so what I expect from this brand is exactly that. If I want smooth paint, smooth washes, Schmincke is definitely the brand that I go for. A lot of the paints that I currently have in my Schmincke watercolor collections are tubes that I purchased to see how they work, but indigo has been part of my collection for many years. I adore this paint. It is a very deep and dark blue that stays vibrant and dark even upon drying, and it's incredibly smooth. I use this paint very often because I like to paint dark backgrounds, so indigo is definitely my go-to when it comes to Schmincke watercolor paints. Another must-have is Naples Yellow Reddish. Even though I mix my own skin tones with most of my very important work, when I do studies, it's practical to have pre-mixed skin tone that you can rely on, and that's what I'm using this particular paint for. I have it usually poured in my portable palette as well as at hand in my studio in case I just wanna do a quick portrait study. By the way, the 15 milliliter tube that I use takes years to fully use up, and so I think this is a good investment if you're a portrait painter. This is a very high quality premixed skin tone paint. Last one's worth mentioning is this tiny custom set of pinks and magentas by Schmincke. I bought them in 5 milliliter tubes because I'm not gonna use a whole bunch of one particular paint, but these different shades of magenta help me out with floral painting most of all. My selection includes quinacridone magenta, rose madder, permanent carmine magenta, as well as purple magenta. So there's a whole bunch of carmine, roses and magentas in there. These colors are smooth, rich and more vibrant than anything I've ever seen or worked with. Schmincke Horadam paints are definitely on the more expensive side, so the price will vary depending on which shade you're gonna buy because of the pigments that are used, but it could be somewhere between 14 to 18 euros per tube when you're purchasing it online. And for 5 milliliter tubes it could be somewhere around 6 euros to 8 euros per tube. So yeah, They are pretty expensive and I wouldn't like to buy them every single month, but luckily these tubes last quite a long time, and I always put some money aside every time I sell an original painting and spend it on art supplies. So that's how I am luckily able to afford them at this point. Next stop in my watercolor collection are Daniel Smith paints. I own a larger selection of tubes than I have from Schmincke, and I appreciate them mostly for their granulating paints. So if I mentioned that Schmincke gave me smooth results, then Daniel Smith does quite the opposite. Even ultramarine blue, which is a very basic paint to own, is much more granulating than from other brands. I feel like they have a potential to enrich the painting to a level that no other paint could just by itself, so they are very interesting to use in a painting and experiment with them, especially because watercolor is a technique that lacks texture, and so the granulation really adds a lot of visual interest to artworks. However, they are insanely expensive and you will pay a lot even for 5 milliliter tubes, which are not often available actually in Europe where I shop, so I usually only get them in 15 milliliter tubes that are most expensive. And the price ranges in between 13 to even 25 euros per a single 15 milliliter tube. Over the years, I bought some that I keep buying repeatedly and use them up, and I also bought some that I strongly feel like they were a waste of money, so I'm gonna give you a heads up about that as well. As my favorites, I selected my set of purples and violets, a set of greens, and 2 other standalone paints that I would like to show you. These granulating purples are a real treat for the eyes. I love to combine them with greens in my paintings, and I tend to use them alongside of Schmincke depending on whether I need a smooth or rough looking result. All these paints are very light fast, and therefore I use them in my works that I intend to sell or exhibit. There's something even mystical about these dark violet paints that I'm drawn to. I personally get inspired by color more than by anything else, and I find these so beautiful that I just want to create a whole piece dedicated to this particular shade. Recently, I discovered that something similar was done by Van Gogh, which are watercolors by Royal Talens that are much less expensive than Daniel Smith, and they also make granulating paints that look kind of similar. So I made a comparison, but they don't have as many shades, and from what I gathered from their website, the light fastness is also not as excellent as in Daniel Smith paints. But when you compare the price difference, Van Gogh paints being about 2.5 euros per tube, then this is something that is a rather great alternative when you are looking for granulating paints that would give you at least similar shades than watercolor by Daniel Smith. Back to Daniel Smith, here is the selection of greens that I use most often. Lately I've been using a lot of greens in my artworks. The green calms me down, it gives me positive energy, positive vibes. My collection of greens kind of grew during the past 2 years, and I've been specifically looking for interesting greens with a lot of texture, as well as dark green that would serve as the base for my dark backgrounds. Very interesting is the last swatch, which is Cascade Green, and that is a dual pigment paint that goes from darker green towards cobalt turquoise, and the more water you add, the more of this very beautiful turquoise undertone you're gonna get. So this is one very interesting paint to buy, and if I was to choose just one out of these greens to take with me somewhere, then it would definitely be the Cascade Green. I'd like to mention 2 more paints, and that is Potter's Pink and Neutral Tint. Potter's Pink is anything but dark paint. It is rather subtle and very light, but it has beautiful pinkish texture that you can use over another paints as well as just by itself. And Neutral Tint, I prefer it over any kind of black in watercolor, and it serves so many purposes that I go through the 15 milliliter tube very fast. I use it to mix color as well as a standalone replacement for black. As for the paints that I consider rather a waste of money are definitely lavender and wisteria. These paints are definitely very appealing and that's why I initially bought them, but they remind me of a gouache more than a watercolor. They contain white pigment which makes them very opaque, and if you try to produce mixes with them they will all be very muddy, so they are more intended to be used as a standalone pastel-y paints. There is absolutely nothing wrong with this type of watercolor, it's just that other brands have paints that are significantly cheaper and produce, I would even say, exactly the same results. For example, this is another Van Gogh paint that I discovered on accident that costs just €2 and I really can't tell the difference. As a counterpart to the Daniel Smith Wisteria, I discovered this Lilac by ShinHan PWC line, which is actually the professional line. And also you can't tell the difference and the paint look exactly the same to me apart from the price. While Daniel Smith versions of these paints cost €15 for each 15ml tube, the alternative by Van Gogh costs €2 and the alternative by PWC ShinHan costs €6. Other paints that I would not buy anymore are duochrome paints such as saguaro green or aquamarine. They are alright, but it's nothing as impactful as my metallic watercolor by Finetech, and I could easily mix those with another watercolor to achieve similar results than these ones. So I would not waste so much money buying duochromes anymore. And I got kind of disappointed by lapis lazuli as well as kyanite genuine, which are the most expensive Daniel Smith paints. I was kind of disappointed. This might just be personal preference. I still did not find the full potential of these paints. They strike me as something very similar to regular blues that I already have in my collection. Kyanite shimmers, but when it dries, it is very dull, matte and uninteresting to me personally, so I'm not gonna be using it a whole bunch. So yeah, these are definitely something that I would avoid in the future, but maybe they worked for you. Let me know if you have different experiences with these and I might learn something. One more thing that might be worth mentioning is that most Daniel Smith paints that I own are kind of hard to re-wet, reconstitute after they dry. I tried to pour them in my portable palette and use them, but they're never as rich as when I use them fresh from the tube, so that's what I'm trying to do if I'm painting something that is important to me. So that's my recommendation. You should rather use them fresh from the tube than try to use them by reconstituting a dry paint. However, I did not have this kind of problem with Pyrrole Red and Neutral Tint. They did reconstitute properly. It's more of a thing with Potter's Pink and those violets that I mentioned previously. Another brand that I tend to use but not in very large amounts of paints is Winsor Newton Professional Watercolor. I mostly use these two large tubes that I haven't used up yet, even though I have them for a couple of years, and it's Alizarin Crimson, the permanent version, as well as Payne's Grey. The permanent alizarin crimson is the one that I use mostly for mixing up my skin tones, and I'm not gonna swatch it, but the Payne's Grey is definitely worth swatching on camera because it's a very dark, rich paint that is very suitable for my dark backgrounds, and it's very different from indigo. It has a much cooler undertone. With Winsor Newton, my experience is that the paint is better when used straight from the tube than if I'm trying to fill up my palettes with them and try to reconstitute the paint because it gets very stiff. I like that these tubes are really large. I will not run out of this paint for a very long time, and a tube that has 37 milliliters of paint is worth around 22 up to 27 euros per tube. And the last brand that I've been using lately is ShinHan PWC watercolors, which is professional watercolors made in Korea. I bought this set about 2 months ago and I still haven't used it enough, but I have a separate review prepared for you, so I'm not gonna swatch them in this video, but the first impressions were really great. I was able to get this set that has 33 premium colors in it for about 90 euros, which was a great price considering this is a professional watercolor, and the paints were all very pigmented, rich, and they are very easy to re-wet if you want to pour them into palettes and then let them dry and reconstitute them later on. I used these tube paints with plastic palettes by ShinHan. They're available in different sizes. I bought this smaller one out of curiosity and haven't used it yet, but the larger one I'm already using with these paints. It's a large palette, so definitely not something that you would take to do a plein air painting with, but in a studio you get a lot of mixing space there. So the review of the ShinHan pens is coming up soon. Since I use a lot of tube paints, I need palettes to pour the wet paint in and mix to make custom sets and to transport the paint around. I prefer using metallic palettes in different sizes. They either come with pens or half pens or without them, and in that case you would have to buy them separately. I prefer buying them separately because some of the paints that I use I need larger amounts, and this way I can choose which size I'm gonna be using in the particular set that I'm building. Some brands make their own palettes, but many manufacturers make palettes that are compatible with other brands as well. I bought these colorful and fun palettes in different sizes on Amazon. I use the smallest one when I go paint outside. It's very small and not heavy at all. It's easy to transport. Middle-sized is the palette that I'm using at home, and I also transport that one between the studio and home when I'm usually just doing studies. In metallic palette you can also use plastic ones. They come in different shapes and sizes and they are very cheap. You probably will get them in your local art store easily. I do prefer the closable ones so that my paint doesn't gather dust, so I rarely use the trays that don't have lid. And the highest quality type of palette for watercolor is definitely porcelain palettes, but they are very expensive, and so I just used a white plate from IKEA that cost me less than 2 euros to mix my palettes in the studio. Lastly, I want to show you what I bought recently just to test out and compare different sets of paint from different manufacturers. I was hunting for beginners watercolor set. I was just looking for the brands that I know that won't disappoint and searched for the tiniest box of watercolor paints that I could find. Not every box that I bought was a starter spec for beginner watercolorists. For example, very specific and very appealing was this Van Gogh set of pinks and violets that I want to use for botanical painting, and a review still awaits pastel watercolor set by Prima Marketing. And these reviews and my thoughts on these sets will be up on my channel during the upcoming months, so make sure that you subscribe and hit the bell. By the way, I know this was a bit of a longer video, so I'm hoping that it provided you with some useful tips, and if it did, please let me know in the comments and give it a thumbs up, and I will talk to you and see you again in few days. So have a great weekend, have a great week, and bye.